Okay, before we leave Ravenna, we should see at least a couple of things in the Archiepiscopal Museum, which is the much rebuilt former residence of Maximianus, the Archbishop of Ravenna in the middle of the 6th century, whose portrait we saw a while ago with Justinian in San Vitale. I've referred to the fact that until the 12th century or so, the image of the suffering Savior on the cross was not popular, and that it's left out of the episodes in the life of Jesus in the mosaics at San Apollinare Nuovo altogether. Here Jesus looks almost like a Roman centurion, ego sum via veritas et vita, or else. He carries the cross over his shoulder like a weapon. The museum also does have what is thought to be the very cathedra, the very bishop's seat of Maximianus himself, said to have been a gift from Justinian. This is usually called the most impressive ivory work of art to have survived through the Middle Ages. On the front below the seat, you can see John the Baptist and the 4 evangelists, and you can see that central part up more closely now. Above John the Baptist is the monogram of Maximianus, surrounded by Christian symbols, the grapevine, the peacock. Surprisingly, perhaps a Christian symbol, because it was thought that peacocks did not decompose after death, and so were a fit symbol for life eternal. And the stags, apparently in reference to the 42nd Psalm, in which the soul seeks God the way the deer seeks water. Justinian died at the age of 83 in 565, and some consider that to be the date of the real end of the Roman Empire, because no emperor after him was able to maintain any appreciable control of the West, although the so-called Exarchate of Ravenna existed as a nominal outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire until the 8th century. Soon after Justinian died, the Lombards, under their leader Alboin, crossed the Alps from the northeast. They took control of most of northern Italy, over which they fought with each other, with the Eastern Empire, and with the Franks for centuries. In a not atypical episode, Alboin himself was murdered by his wife, whose father he had killed and from whose skull he had made a punch bowl. Alboin established his headquarters in Pavia, but the most famous of the early Lombard queens, Theodolinda, made her residence in Monza, which then shared with Pavia, the honor of being the de facto capital of the Lombard kingdom. This is the crown of Theodolinda, now in the Monza Cathedral treasury. She was actually a Bavarian by birth. Authori, who became king of the Lombards in 584, is said to have wanted to marry a woman who really loved him for himself, and having heard of the beauty and virtue of Theodolinda, he paid court to her in disguise as just an ordinary nobleman, figuring that any woman would marry a king, even sight unseen, whether she loved him or not. The scheme worked. She fell in love with him rather than a crown, and then he surprised her with the truth. She was to be queen of the Lombards. Considering that the first 3 rulers of the Lombards in Italy were all assassinated, she may have then figured she wouldn't be married to him very long in any case. But though in fact he died young, he was not assassinated. And by that time she had so endeared herself to her Lombard subjects that they said she could choose a new husband, and that he would thereby be accepted as their king. And this was a rare opportunity for any woman. And some think she could have made a better choice. This is Egil Ulf, new husband of Theodolinda and new king of the Lombards, but this is on his war helmet, so that explains why he might not look his best. Egil Ulf was an Arian, and Theodolinda was a Nicene Christian. As I've said, that means she was a mainstream follower of the Pope in Rome and accepted the Nicene Creed. By this time, too, the term Catholic, perhaps first used to designate the Christian religion by St. Ignatius of Antioch as early as 100 AD, was commonly in use in effect as a synonym for Nicene Christian, so it's not wrong to call Theodolinda a Roman Catholic. The word Catholic just comes from the Latin Catholicus, which means universal. Agilulf donated this cross to the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Monza that had been founded by his wife Theodolinda, so he was obviously not a fanatical Arian, and he also allowed their children to be raised as Roman Catholics. When Gregory I, Gregory the Great, became Pope in 590, one of his main projects was the conversion of Agilulf through the efforts of Theodolinda. An interesting correspondence, in fact, survives in which he exhorts her to try and make this happen. But although Agilulf did agree, as I said, to let his wife raise the children Catholic, he himself never made the switch. This, in the Monza Cathedral treasury also, is one of the more peculiar pieces of Lombard art to survive from the 6th century. These chicks are about life-size, but who knows what they were for. I think the truth is that they were probably just supposed to be a kind of centerpiece for the dinner table of their majesties. I might just mention that in his account of the story of Theodolinda and Agilulf, Gibbon says that it shows the Lombards had the right to elect their own sovereign, but the good sense to decline the frequent use of what he calls this dangerous privilege. And remember, The Decline and Fall was published in 1776. This is what the Church of St. Gregory the Great looks like today in Rome. The church as it stands now was rebuilt around 1700. But Gregory was born in what we could consider a palace here. His great-grandfather had also been a pope, which might puzzle you, but in the early Middle Ages, married priests were not uncommon, and in the Eastern Orthodox Church still to this day, the marriage of priests is permitted. It was, in fact, only really after the Schism of 1054 that a real attempt was made to end clerical marriage in the West. There were also married priests who were widowers with children at the time of ordination. Anyway, like a lot of great religious leaders, Gregory was born into a wealthy family, but saw therefore, perhaps sooner than the rest of us, that money doesn't buy happiness, and turned his palace into a monastery. He was elected pope against his will and regretted the need to leave the simple life of a monk, although he had, by the time he was elected, served in several important political and religious offices, including that of papal nuncio, that is, ambassador to Constantinople. This is the cover now of the Gospel Book of Theodolinda in the Monza Cathedral treasury today. When Theodolinda had her son baptized a Roman Catholic, Gregory sent this book as a gift to the family. The 4 cameos are probably Roman emperors, but on this book cover they represent the 4 evangelists. Will Durant calls Gregory the first medieval man because he had no interest in classical literature or science and was totally devoted to religion. Despite the fact that he's recognized as one of the 4 great doctors, too, he is remembered more for his humanity than for his theology. In addition to all sorts of more formal writings, some 800 letters by him survive, and most all are attempts to help members of his flock cope with their problems, spiritual, political, personal, whatever. Always, though, with the end in view of getting them to see that the final solution to any problem is faith. He called himself Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God, lived very simply and built little, preferring to give away money to support the poor. No pope before him, and not all that many after him, emphasized charity to the extent that he did. This is a closer view of the Gospel book cover. You can see Theodolinda's name on it here. Gregory argued with Constantinople over the right to the title Patriarch, but he recognized that the real future of the Roman Catholic Church lay not in the East but in the West, and concentrated his efforts not on the probably hopeless job of winning submission from Byzantium, but in the conversion of the barbarians like the Lombards. It was to this end that he sent St. Augustine on his famous mission to England, about which we'll eventually hear. I might just mention that the original name for Constantinople, as you probably remember, was Byzantium, and so the state headquartered there is sometimes called the Byzantine or Byzantine Empire. You can pretty much pronounce it any way you like. This is an ivory plaque now depicting Gregory writing, and he probably put about as many words on paper as anyone in his age. It looks like it took 3 copyists just to keep up with him. The dove on his shoulder, representing the Holy Spirit, is his attribute. Gregory's name is probably most well known today because of its connection with the liturgical music of the Middle Ages. He is popularly given credit for, in effect, editing the Missal so as to give it the form it essentially still has. He, as it were, put his stamp of approval on the liturgical texts and the music that would go with them. How much of the modern Graduale Romanum, the texts and the music of the Mass liturgy, is really Gregory's work, it's now, however, very difficult to say. It is, of course, unlikely that the tradition that he was responsible for this would have developed without some reason. It doesn't seem unlikely that he was at least heavily involved in the editing and organization of the liturgy and its music, but no actual examples of liturgical music he can be certain to have composed or revised survive. We'll hear some more later about music in the Middle Ages, but in a sense, Gregorian chants aren't music in the usual sense at all. They are not meant to be listened to by an audience in the manner of music as we usually think of it. They are sung prayers. The development of early liturgical music is a very complex subject, of course. As I mentioned earlier, there were several competing liturgies, and the Roman or Gregorian one was not essentially completely victorious in the West until the 11th century. Also, from the Oxyrhynchus hymn to the Trinity, which we heard last time, until about the 9th century, there are essentially no manuscripts which preserve any sort of musical notation. So sorting out the development of the music used in the various liturgies and ultimately in the Gregorian is obviously something about which there's going to be a lot of argument for a long time. From the 9th century, if not before, to more or less the 11th century, musical notation was in the form of various signs called neumes placed over the text. They indicate more than just pitch. There are about 7 different varieties of them, basically, and they can tell musicologists, paleomusicologists, really quite a little bit about the way the music was sung. We'll see some other examples next week, too. And we'll hear the Alleluia now from a Mass for Christmas Day. The text, Dies Sanctificatus Eluxit Nobis, a sacred day has dawned on us, is still present in the Alleluia of the third Mass for Christmas in the traditional Missal. And while we hear this, which Gregory might recognize, we'll see some of the churches in Rome that were built more or less in his day and which he might also recognize. Alleluia, Alleluia. This is the Church of San Lorenzo, St. Lawrence, outside the walls as it's called. This church was begun before Gregory became Pope, earlier in the 6th century, and has the colonnaded portico in front of a basilica again. Here you're looking from the choir toward the nave in this church. The choir is the older part. The nave was redone in around 1200. You can see how in this church, as in many others, scavenged parts of classical buildings were used. This is San Giorgio in Velabro, another 6th century Roman church. This may have been a late Roman mausoleum, but in any case became the church of San Teodoro around 500 or so. This is the church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, originally built in the 6th century, but remodeled in the 8th and in the 12th and somewhat later than that even. Here's the nave now. One of the most interesting things St. Gregory wrote is a biography of St. Benedict, famous for definitively establishing organized Christian monasticism in the West in 529 at Monte Cassino here between Rome and Naples. Some credit for the development of organized monasticism should go to St. Basil in the East, whom I mentioned earlier in the 4th century, and St. Pachomius, also in the 4th century in Egypt. But as far as Western Europe goes, Benedict is the real leader, and he was the author of the rule, regula, the regula used by virtually all monasteries for hundreds of years. The abbey at Monte Cassino was obliterated in World War II, but by that time it had already been wrecked and rebuilt several times. This is the way the abbey at Monte Cassino looks today. Gregory says that Benedict's cure for temptation was to roll in bramble bushes whenever he thought about the object of it. Think of a pretty girl, roll in bramble bushes. Then pretty soon just thinking of the object of temptation would produce the feeling of being poked all over by brambles. It's sort of the Pavlovian idea, I guess. Something else Gregory says about Benedict has always seemed very important to me. Of him he says, mortuus est, tamen loquet. He's dead, but he speaks. That's the essence of the written word, of literature. Dead people can talk to us. This is the way the abbey at Monte Cassino looks inside now. Not at all, of course, the way it would be remembered by Benedict, but when it was rebuilt after World War II, it was rebuilt as it looked before that most recent destruction. Benedict would think he'd wandered into the emperor's palace by mistake if he came here now. As Gregory is traditionally associated with the composition of the Missal, Benedict is associated with the composition of the Breviary, the book which contains the liturgy for the divine office celebrated in monasteries at various times throughout the day and night. Benedict does, in fact, provide a simple breviary in the course of his regula, the rule. Benedictine monks don't pray all the time, however. The abbeys were self-supporting, and the monks, in addition to their liturgical schedule and scriptural reading, devoted 5 hours a day to the less spiritual work of farming, cleaning, and general maintenance. This is the building in Ravenna called Theodoric's Palace. It looks a bit like a palace, but it almost certainly had nothing to do with Theodoric and was apparently built around 700. It's the last ancient building to survive in Ravenna from before the fall of the city to King Aistulf and the Lombards in 751. The Lombards had been rapidly won over to Roman Catholicism after 600, after the days of Theodelinda and Agilulf, but that didn't mean that they necessarily did everything the Pope wanted. And when Ravenna fell to Aistulf, Pope Zacharias became nervous and asked Pepin the Short of the Franks for help. Gibbon says Pepin paid no attention because, as he puts it, we are cold to the relation of distant misery. So the next Pope, Stephen III, not counting Stephen II, who only reigned for 2 days, went all the way to Paris and offered to crown Pepin to legitimize what some considered to be a usurpation, and this got a better response. Pepin went to Italy, took Ravenna, and over the protests of Constantinople and the people of Ravenna itself, gave it and other territory in central Italy to the Pope in the so-called donation of Pepin. We're going to backtrack a bit now to pick up the history of Pepin's people, the Franks. According to legend and some history, the Franks in large numbers began to cross the Rhine from east to west under their leader Merovech in the 5th century AD, and the first dynasty of Franks is called Merovingian after him. These Teutonic or Germanic Franks displaced the Romanized Gauls, who were Celts, as well as eventually the Visigoths, who were, like the Franks, Teutonic and had settled mostly in the south of and west of what is modern France. We have little reliable information about Merovech, but his son Childeric is a bit more well known, and we even have a sort of portrait of him. This is a copy of a gold ring, which was recovered from his tomb. The original was stolen and flung into the Seine. Our main source for the early history of the Franks is the history of Saint Gregory, a late 6th century bishop of Tours, not to be confused with the Pope of the same name. His goal, he says, is to tell us about the miracles of the saints and the slaughters of the nations. He says, in effect, that if people are losing hope about the end of the world and the second coming, they should just be patient. The way things are going, he says, it can't be far off. Will Durant calls him barbarous, ignorant, and prejudiced, but Kenneth Clark says he was remarkably intelligent and unprejudiced. He is certainly credulous, which is, however, a failing from which every medieval historian suffers, but he does tell good stories. These parts of the sword of Childeric were also thrown in the Seine with the original of the ring we just saw, but they were recovered. One of the people Gregory talks about is the late 5th century Saint Apollinaris Sidonius, like Boethius, sometimes called the last classical man. Like Ambrose, he was chosen to be a bishop before he'd even been ordained. He was also married. Gregory of Tours says that when he felt compelled to give his silver plate to the poor, his wife demanded that he compensate her for the loss. He did enjoy the good life himself, though, and his letters are full of descriptions of the villas, libraries, and entertainments available to a man of his social standing. Will Durant sees him as the intellectual ancestor in France of people like Montaigne and Sainte-Beuve, but it was to be a long time after his death before he was to have many intellectual descendants at all. The Merovingian Franks did not go in much for libraries and the classics. This is the baptistry of Saint-Jean, Poitiers. It was founded in the 4th century and remodeled in the 7th, and it is one of the oldest Christian buildings in France. Venantius Fortunatus, a friend of Gregory of Tours, was bishop here in the 6th century, and like Sidonius, he admired the classics and attempted to imitate them, but he's best remembered for his hymns. The Gallican liturgy of the early Middle Ages in France was, like the Ambrosian and Mozarabic liturgies, later suppressed, and, unlike the latter two, is now nowhere in use, and no manuscripts of Gallican chants per se survive, but two of Fortunatus's best-known hymns for the Gallican liturgy were taken into the Gregorian liturgy. One is the Good Friday hymn Pange Lingua, which you're hearing now, and the other is Vexilla Regis Prodeunt, Let the Banners of the King Advance, which is sung at Vespers from the Saturday before Passion Sunday to Maundy Thursday, and also at Vespers on various feast days. You're still hearing Pange Lingua by Fortunatus. This is another early Christian building in France, the baptistry at Fréjus on the Riviera. Childeric's successor was Clovis, who was, like his father, not a Christian, but he married one, Clotilda. She was able to persuade him to have their son baptized, but the boy died shortly thereafter, which was discouraging to a would-be convert. Clotilda was a persuasive woman, however, because Clovis consented to a second try with another son, and this time the boy survived. Then, when Clovis was hard-pressed in battle, he invoked the aid of Jesus. This, so he thought, turned the tide, and in 496 he was baptized at Reims by Saint Remy, thereby becoming the first Christian king of France and the man the French consider the real founder of the French monarchy. The original baptistry at Reims doesn't survive, but it probably looked something like this. Clovis made Paris his capital, and he died there, although it was not until much later that it really became something like a permanent capital. Many of the Merovingian and Carolingian kings hardly spent any time there at all. Here you see the so-called Baths of Cluny, which were probably built in the 3rd century and which Clovis might have used as a residence. Little else that is still above ground in the city would be familiar to him. Our source for the story of the conversion of Clovis is Gregory of Tours again, and he also tells us about the affair of the vase of Soissons. This is the Gourdon chalice, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and one of the most important surviving examples of Merovingian craftsmanship. It's probably something like the Soissons vase. Anyway, the story goes that after sacking the city of Soissons, Clovis wanted the vase in question for himself, and a man described only as a foolish fellow by Gregory of Tours smashed it because he couldn't have it. Clovis did nothing at the time, but later at some sort of military review, when he came to this same foolish fellow, he took the latter's axe from him and threw it on the ground. And when the fellow bent over to pick it up, Clovis smashed the fool's head with his own axe, saying, "That's what you did to my vase at Soissons." Gregory says he thereby aroused great dread of himself. I should point out that he had not yet become a Christian when this happened, but it is true that he smashed a good many more heads after he became a Christian. This is a buckle that once belonged to Clovis's daughter-in-law, Arnagonda, who was buried at Saint-Denis, north of Paris. Even though Paris, as I said, was only irregularly a residence for most Merovingian and Carolingian kings, many were buried at Saint-Denis because of the prestige of Saint-Denis, who had been the first bishop of Paris, Saint Denis, in the 3rd century, and walked with his severed head under his arm, all the way from Montmartre to the location of the abbey, 10 miles outside Paris. There is really nothing that can be called art in the narrow sense surviving from the Merovingians, although they were fine craftsmen on a small scale, which is a bit surprising considering their reputation as ham-fisted barbarians. It's almost like they thought everything they made should be portable because, as in the centuries of their nomadic wanderings, they might have to move on again the next day. We're going to see a few more examples of their work now, and hear one of the earlier pieces of secular music to survive from the Middle Ages. Much less attention was paid, understandably, to the preservation of popular music than to the preservation of liturgical music, and there's probably no source of popular music that is earlier than the 11th century. The example we're going to hear is from the famous collection at Benediktbeuren, site of the oldest monastery in Bavaria. In Latin, the collection is known as the Carmina Burana, and it was, of course, the inspiration behind the celebrated modern Carmina Burana of Karl Orff. Despite the fact that the manuscript comes from no earlier than 1100 or so, and most manuscripts in this collection are later than that, it can be assumed that the sort of music in them had been popular for some time, maybe even some centuries. The instrumental music you've been hearing on and off while I've been talking about the Franks also comes from the Carmina Burana, the Benediktbeuren manuscripts. This is a fibula, which is like a big safety pin. This is another fibula. A buckle, of course. Another buckle. And a piece of Merovingian glassware called a proboscis beaker, put back together from about 100 pieces by some poor graduate student, I suppose. And this is the Frankish helmet. Clovis, like most of his descendants for centuries, divided what he owned among his sons at his death. This would have been ruinous to political stability even if all the heirs were saints, and they weren't. They were mostly violent, greedy, and stupid. In 732, Charles Martel, an illegitimate son of the Merovingian king Pepin II, led an army which defeated the Muslims at the celebrated Battle of Tours or Poitiers, and he eventually became the de facto ruler of France while allowing the nominal Merovingian king Theodoric IV to sit on the throne as a puppet. When Charles Martel died, his son Pepin the Short, as he's known, put Childeric III, the last nominal Merovingian king, into a monastery, this was 751, and founded a new dynasty. He's the fellow we heard about earlier who came to the aid of the papacy and took Ravenna from the Lombards. The dynasty he founded, the Carolingian, is named after his son Carolus Magnus, whom we know as Charlemagne, and we'll hear about him next time.